The salty breeze coming off the South China Sea here in Vung Tau smells entirely different from the thick, humid air of Biscayne Bay. For 30 years, my life was measured in blocks, traffic lights, and the persistent ticking of the meter in my yellow cab. I am Roberto Fuentes, 68 years old now. 3 years ago, I traded the neon-lit chaos of Miami for this quiet, coastal peninsula in Vietnam. Back then, my life was a steering wheel and a dispatcher's voice. Today, it is the sound of waves, the smell of grilling fish, and the profound realization that my Social Security check of $900, which was a death sentence in Florida, is a passport to freedom here. In my pocket, I still carry a small laminated piece of cardboard. It is my old Miami taxi license. The corners are frayed. The photo shows a younger man with darker hair and eyes that still believed the American dream was something you could catch if you just drove fast enough. I keep it not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder. It was the anchor that held me down for 3 decades, a piece of paper that became utterly worthless overnight. Let me take you back. For 30 years, I was the unseen ghost of Miami. I drove the drunks from South Beach at 3 in the morning, the panicked businessmen to the airport, the tourists who complained about the heat before they even left the terminal. Little Havana was my home, but the cab was my universe. I knew every pothole on Calle Ocho, every shortcut through Brickell, when the traffic on Interstate 95 came to a dead halt. The road was my life, and for a long time, it was a good life. We were not rich, my Carmen and I, but we provided. We sent Eduardo to college. We helped Isabel when she moved to Hialeah. The cab paid for groceries, birthdays, and the occasional weekend trip up to Orlando. But then the world changed. It did not happen all at once, though looking back, it feels like it did. First, there were whispers of a new application on the telephone where people could just summon a car with a button. We laughed at it at the taxi stand. Who would get into a stranger's personal car? But then the streets flooded with them, regular cars with glowing stickers in their windows, taking our fares, undercutting our prices. Uber destroyed the taxi industry like a hurricane tearing off a roof. It was ruthless and efficient. Suddenly, my shifts went from 10 hours to 14, just to make half of what I used to. The value of a taxi medallion, which was supposed to be my retirement, evaporated into thin air. We were left holding worthless paper. The freedom of the road turned into a cage of debt and exhaustion. Then the hardest blow fell. Carmen, my beautiful Carmen, my wife of 40 years, passed away. It was swift, a sickness that took her before we even had time to realize how serious it was. Without her, the small house in Little Havana felt like a tomb. The city we had loved, the city we had built our lives in, suddenly became hostile. Miami was exploding in cost. Rent was doubling. Groceries felt like luxury on sorry items. And everywhere I looked, shiny new condominiums were replacing the modest homes we knew. The city was pushing us out, erasing our history to make room for billionaires and investors. I was 65 years old, brokenhearted and exhausted. My Social Security check was $900 a month. In Miami, $900 does not even cover the rent for a closet. I was facing the terrifying reality of moving into Eduardo's spare bedroom, becoming a burden to my son, losing the last shred of my independence. Huanquicu. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills, realizing that the country I had worked so hard for had no place for me in my old age. It was a mathematical impossibility. $900 in Miami meant slow starvation or total reliance on my children. I could not accept either. That was when I started searching. I spent hours at the public library looking for places where a man could live on a tiny pension. I read about Mexico, Panama, the Philippines, but nothing clicked until I stumbled upon a book. It was called You Were Never Meant to Stay by Alan Walker. The title alone struck me like a physical blow. You Were Never Meant to Stay by Alan Walker. It was about expatriates, about realizing that the geographic location of your birth or your working years does not have to dictate where you find your peace. The book spoke of Southeast Asia, of places where the cost of living was a fraction of the West, where communities were tight-knit and life moved at a different pace. I started researching Vietnam, specifically Vung Tau. It was described as a coastal city, a peninsula just a couple of hours from Saigon. It had beaches, fresh seafood, and most importantly, it was incredibly affordable. A place where my $900 would not just let me survive, but let me live. When I told my children, they thought the grief had finally driven me mad. Eduardo sat in my living room, shaking his head. "You do not speak the language, Papa," he said. "You have never been to Asia." Isabel cried, begging me to just move to Hialeah with her. But I showed them the math. I explained that I needed to do this, not just for the money, but for my soul. I needed a radical change. I needed to reinvent what the freedom of the road meant to me. It took months of arguing, reassuring, and planning, but eventually they understood. They saw the desperation in my eyes, and they saw the spark of hope that this crazy plan had ignited in me. The arrival in Vung Tau was a shock to the senses. The heat was familiar, reminiscent of a Miami August, but everything else was alien. The chaotic ballet of thousands of motorbikes, the smells of fish sauce and lemongrass, the tonal symphony of the Vietnamese language. But amidst the chaos, there was a profound sense of safety and welcome. I rented a small, clean apartment with a balcony overlooking the sea for $250 a month. Suddenly, the impossible math of Miami became an abundance. For the first time in years, I breathed out. Life here is simple, yet incredibly rich. My days start early, walking along the front beach as the sun rises, watching the fishing boats return with their catch. The beach life here is not about posing in expensive swimsuits. It is about community, families gathering to eat, exercise, and be together. I spend my mornings learning a few words of Vietnamese, my afternoons reading or sitting at a cafe with a strong, sweet iced coffee that costs less than $1. Though, of course, we deal in dong here, not dollars. The defining moment, the moment I knew I had made the right choice, happened a few weeks after I arrived. I was sitting at a plastic table on the beach, the sand between my toes. I ordered a plate of freshly caught grilled squid, seasoned with chili and lime, and a cold local beer. The entire meal cost me $3. As I sat there, savoring the incredible flavors, looking out at the vast ocean, a memory hit me. I remembered driving a wealthy tourist couple from their luxury hotel in South Beach to a high-end seafood restaurant downtown. I remembered their casual conversation about a $60 appetizer. I realized that the meal I was eating right now for $3 was fresher, better, and more authentic than anything they were paying $60 for. And I was eating it, looking at the same ocean, feeling the same breeze. It was a complete financial and emotional breakdown of everything I thought I knew about value and wealth. I pulled out my old taxi license and looked at it. That piece of plastic represented 30 years of chasing something that was always just out of reach. It represented stress, traffic, and a system that ultimately discarded me. And here I was, halfway across the world, living a life of leisure and dignity on a fraction of what I needed back there, from driving strangers to living free. The contrast was staggering. Of course, it has not been without difficulties. The language barrier is a daily challenge. Sometimes I crave a real Cuban sandwich so badly it aches, and there are moments of profound loneliness, missing Carmen, missing the easy familiarity of my old neighborhood. Being an immigrant twice in one lifetime, first from Cuba to America and now from America to Vietnam, is a unique kind of fatigue. But the community here, both the locals and the small group of expatriates, have been incredibly supportive. There is a shared understanding among us that we have opted out of a game we could no longer win. Last month, Eduardo and Isabel came to visit. They were nervous, expecting to find me living in a shack, struggling to get by. Instead, they found me healthier, tanner, and happier than I had been in a decade. I took them to my favorite seafood spot on the beach. I introduced them to my local friends. We walked along the promenade at sunset. By the end of their trip, the worry in their eyes had been replaced by a quiet respect. They saw that my $900 here bought me something priceless, peace of mind. If you want to know more about the logistics, the visa process, or how I manage my budget, the link is in the comments. But the real lesson I want to share is not about money. It is about courage. It is about realizing that when the road you are on turns into a dead end, you have the power to draw a new map. My taxi license sits in a drawer now, a relic of a past life. I no longer drive strangers to their destinations. I have finally arrived at my own. The freedom of the road was never about the car. It was about the direction you choose to go. And I chose the sea, the peace, and a life where I am truly, finally free. Let me tell you more about the yellow cab. It was a Ford Crown Victoria, a heavy, sturdy machine that felt like a tank on the narrow streets of Miami Beach. That car was my office, my dining room, and my confessional. I listened to people cry over broken marriages. I heard businessmen celebrate millions made in a single afternoon, and I drove silent, exhausted workers back to their small apartments at dawn. For 30 years, I was a silent witness to the entire spectrum of human emotion reflected in the rearview mirror. I took pride in my work. My cab was always clean. I always wore a collared shirt. I knew the city so intimately that I could navigate it blindfolded, guided only by the changing textures of the asphalt and the smell of the ocean breeze mixed with exhaust fumes. But as the years crept by, the romance faded into a grinding reality. The heat of Miami is relentless, and the air conditioning in the cab was a constant battle. The traffic grew worse every year, choking the city in a perpetual gridlock. The long hours sitting behind the wheel took their toll on my back, my knees, and my spirit. Yet I kept driving because I had to. The meter was the metronome of our lives, dictating what we could afford and what we had to sacrifice. Every tick meant a few more cents toward the mortgage, the electricity bill, Eduardo's tuition. When the ride-sharing companies arrived, they did not just take our customers, they took our dignity. I remember the first time I saw one of their cars pick up a passenger right in front of me at the airport taxi rank. A young man staring at his telephone walked right past my waiting cab and climbed into an unmarked sedan. The unfairness of it burned in my chest. We had paid thousands for our licenses, submitted to background checks, vehicle inspections, and strict city regulations. They had downloaded an application. The city abandoned us. The politicians who used to court our union turned a blind eye as our livelihoods were decimated. We were obsolete, relics of a bygone era, replaced by an algorithm. The financial ruin was immediate. The value of my taxi license, which I had planned to sell to fund my retirement, plummeted to zero. The nest egg we had counted on simply vanished. I had to work twice as many hours just to keep our heads above water. The stress was suffocating. I would come home at 3 a.m, bone-tired, reeking of stale coffee and gasoline, only to wake up 4 hours later and do it all again. It was a treadmill that I could not step off, and it was slowly killing me. Then came the darkness. Carmen's illness was a swift, merciless shadow that fell over our lives. From the diagnosis to the funeral, it was less than 6 months. She was my anchor, the soft light in the harsh reality of my days. Her laughter could make me forget the rude passengers, the traffic jams, the mounting bills. When she left, the silence in our home was deafening. I was 65, a widower, a driver without a destination. The city outside my window, the city we had navigated together, felt alien and cold. Miami, once a haven for immigrants looking for a new start, had transformed into a playground for the ultra-rich. The modest neighborhoods where working-class families like ours lived were being bulldozed and replaced by luxury towers. The local bakeries and corner stores were replaced by high-end boutiques and artisanal coffee shops. I felt like a ghost haunting a city that had already moved on. My Social Security check of $900 was a cruel joke. The property taxes on our small house alone consumed half of it. The rest went to electricity, water, and the bare minimum of food. I was trapped in a financial vice, slowly being squeezed out of my own life. The fear of becoming a burden to my children was a constant gnawing pain in my stomach. Eduardo had his own family, his own struggles, and Isabel was just starting her career. I could not bear the thought of taking from them, of moving into a spare room and becoming a dependent. I had been a provider all my life. The idea of needing to be provided for was unbearable. I needed a solution, a way out of the trap that America had become for me. The discovery of Vietnam was not a sudden revelation, but a slow, desperate search for survival. I spent days in the public library poring over articles, blogs, and forums about retiring abroad. I looked at countries in Central America, but the costs there were rising too. I looked at Eastern Europe, but the winters were too harsh for my old bones. And then I found that book, You Were Never Meant to Stay by Alan Walker. That phrase, "You were never meant to stay," echoed in my mind like a bell. It challenged the fundamental assumption that we must die in the place where we spent our working lives. It gave me permission to look beyond the borders of my familiar misery. The more I read about Vietnam, the more it felt like a lifeline. The cost of living was a fraction of what it was in Miami. Healthcare was affordable. The climate was tropical, warm year-round, just like the Florida I had loved. Vung Tau, specifically, called to me. It was not a chaotic megacity like Saigon, but a coastal retreat, a place where the ocean breeze offered a respite from the heat. The pictures showed sweeping beaches, forested hills, and a vibrant street life that reminded me of the Havana of my childhood, long before I ever saw Miami. Telling my children was the hardest part. I gathered them in the living room of the house where they had grown up, the house that I now had to sell to pay off the remaining debt. Eduardo's face contorted in disbelief. Isabel wept openly. They argued that it was too far, too foreign, too dangerous for an old man alone. But I showed them the spreadsheets, the endless columns of numbers that proved my point. I showed them that in Miami I would be a pauper, slowly wasting away. In Vietnam I could live with dignity. I could afford to eat out, to have a comfortable apartment, to travel a little. I could be independent. It was the hardest conversation of my life, but beneath their fear, they understood my desperation. They knew I was fighting for my survival, not just physically, but spiritually. The journey was grueling. 24 hours of flying, multiple layovers, the bewildering sheer scale of the airports. When I finally landed in Ho Chi Minh City, the wall of heat and humidity that hit me when I walked out of the terminal was both familiar and utterly foreign. The drive to Vung Tau was a sensory overload, motorbikes weaving through traffic like schools of fish. The endless honking, the smell of the street food mixed with exhaust, the lush green countryside dotted with small villages. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. My first apartment in Vung Tau was a small, clean place near the back beach. The rent was $250. For another $100, I had a woman come twice a week to clean and do my laundry. My groceries, mostly fresh vegetables, tropical fruits, and local pork and chicken, cost me less than $50 a week. Suddenly, the $900 that had been a starvation ration in Miami felt like a fortune. The profound relief that washed over me in those first few weeks is something I will never forget. The constant tight knot of financial anxiety in my chest began to loosen. I could breathe. Living in Vung Tau has been a process of profound unlearning. In Miami, time was money. Every minute stuck in traffic was a minute I was not earning. Here, time is just time. It stretches out, unhurried and unstructured. I wake up before dawn, when the air is still cool, and walk down to the beach. The sand is packed hard by the receding tide, and the sky turns brilliant shades of pink and orange. The locals are already there, swimming, practicing Tai Chi, or simply sitting in groups, talking and laughing. There is a sense of community here that is woven into the very fabric of daily life.